I'm Maya, 26, and the moment my sister announced her pregnancy, I knew my life was about to become a nightmare. Not because I wasn't happy for her, but because the father of her baby was the same man who had stalked me for 8 months and left me sleeping with a baseball bat under my bed. When I refused to attend her baby shower, my family launched a social media campaign calling me jealous and bitter. What they didn't know was that I had a restraining order with his name on it, and my sister knew exactly who he was when she started dating him. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The first time I saw David Martinez at my sister Emma's apartment, my blood turned to ice water. There he was, lounging on her couch like he belonged there, wearing that same charming smile that had fooled me 3 years earlier. Emma was beaming as she introduced him as her new boyfriend, completely oblivious to the fact that I had gone rigid in the doorway, my hands trembling so badly I had to shove them into my jacket pockets. "Maya, meet David," she said, practically glowing with happiness. "David, this is my little sister I've told you so much about." The recognition in his eyes was immediate and predatory. His smile widened as he stood up, extending his hand toward me. "Nice to finally meet you, Maya. Emma talks about you constantly." I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The walls of Emma's living room felt like they were closing in on me, and suddenly, I was back in my old apartment, listening to him pound on my door at 2 a.m, screaming that I belonged to him. I was back to changing my phone number 3 times, back to taking different routes to work, back to checking over my shoulder every time I left my house. "Maya?" Emma's voice sounded far away. "Are you okay? You look pale." I forced myself to take a step backward, still staring at David's outstretched hand. "I need to go," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. "What? But you just got here," Emma protested, confusion written all over her face. "I made dinner, and I wanted you two to get to know each other." The irony wasn't lost on me. If only she knew how well David and I already knew each other. How well he knew my work schedule, my favorite coffee shop, the exact time I walked my dog every evening. How well I knew the sound of his voice leaving threatening voicemails, the weight of his presence lurking outside my apartment building. "I'm not feeling well," I lied, backing toward the door. "Rain check?" I didn't wait for an answer. I practically ran to my car, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of David watching me from Emma's window. That same calculating expression I remembered from our final confrontation. The next few weeks were torture. Emma called constantly, gushing about her new relationship, completely unaware that every detail she shared felt like a knife twisting in my chest. She told me about their romantic dinners, their weekend getaways, how he surprised her with flowers at work. Each story was a reminder of how he had love-bombed me in the beginning, how charming and attentive he had been before the mask slipped. I tried to warn her, but how do you tell your sister that her perfect boyfriend is actually a dangerous stalker without sounding like a jealous ex? Every time I opened my mouth to say something, the words died in my throat. Emma was so happy, more radiant than I had ever seen her, and I knew she wouldn't believe me. David was too smart, too manipulative. He would have already started planting seeds about me being unstable, jealous, bitter about our breakup. 3 months into their relationship, Emma called me with news that made my world collapse entirely. "Maya, I have something incredible to tell you," she practically sang into the phone. "David proposed." My phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering onto my kitchen floor. I scrambled to pick it up, catching only fragments of Emma's excited chatter about wedding venues and dress shopping. When I finally managed to speak, my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Congratulations," I forced out, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "I want you to be my maid of honor," Emma continued, oblivious to my distress. David said he can't wait to officially be part of our family. He thinks you're wonderful, by the way. He mentions you all the time. Of course he did. David was many things, but he wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what he was doing, insinuating himself into my family, making it impossible for me to avoid him. This was his ultimate revenge for me getting that restraining order, for escaping his control. He couldn't have me, so he would take my sister instead and make sure I had to watch. The engagement party was held at my parents' house 2 weeks later. I stood in the corner, nursing a glass of wine and watching David work the room like the consummate performer he was. He had my mother laughing at his jokes, my father nodding approvingly at his career prospects, my aunts and uncles charmed by his attentiveness to Emma. It was a masterclass in manipulation, and I was the only one who could see through it. "You seem quiet tonight," my mother said, appearing beside me with a concerned expression. "Everything okay, honey?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and tell her that the man she was welcoming into our family was dangerous, that he had made my life a living hell, that Emma was in more danger than she could possibly imagine. Instead, I forced a smile and nodded. "Just tired from work," I lied. "You know how it is." My mother studied my face for a moment, then patted my arm gently. "I know it must be hard seeing Emma so happy when you're still single, but your time will come, sweetheart." The assumption stung more than it should have. Even my own mother couldn't fathom that my distress might have nothing to do with jealousy and everything to do with genuine fear for Emma's safety. I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face and trying to slow my racing heart. When I emerged, David was waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall with that familiar, predatory smile. "Hello, Maya," he said softly, his voice carrying that same undertone that used to make my skin crawl. "Having fun at the party?" "Stay away from me," I whispered, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "Now, why would I do that?" he asked, taking a step closer. "We're going to be family soon. We should get along, don't you think?" "Emma doesn't know who you really are," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But I could tell her." David laughed, a cold sound that made my blood run cold. "Tell her what? That we used to date?" "She already knows that, Maya. I told her all about our relationship, how you became obsessed with me, how you couldn't handle it when I broke up with you, how you made up stories to try to get me in trouble." The casual way he rewrote history made me dizzy with rage. "That's not what happened, and you know it." "Do I?" He tilted his head, still smiling. "Because the way I remember it, you were the one who couldn't let go. You were the one calling and texting constantly. You were the one showing up at my work, my apartment, my gym. I had to threaten to call the police just to get you to leave me alone." "You're lying," I breathed. But even as I said it, I could see how carefully he had constructed this narrative. How believable it would sound to someone who hadn't lived through the real version. "Am I? Then why haven't you told Emma about us? If you were really the victim, wouldn't that be the first thing you'd do?" His smile widened. "Face it, Maya, you know she wouldn't believe you. Deep down, you know that everyone can see what you really are." Before I could respond, Emma's voice echoed down the hallway. "David, where did you go?" "Right here, beautiful," he called back, never taking his eyes off me. "Just catching up with your sister." Emma appeared around the corner, her face lighting up when she saw us together. "Oh, good. I was hoping you two would get a chance to talk. I know you're going to be such good friends." David wrapped his arm around Emma's waist, pulling her close. "Absolutely. Maya and I understand each other perfectly." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but Emma just smiled and leaned into him. I watched them walk away together, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, feeling more helpless than I had in years. 6 months later, Emma called with another announcement that sent me spiraling into panic. "Maya, we're pregnant!" she squealed into the phone, her joy so pure and infectious that it broke my heart. "Can you believe it? We weren't even trying, but David is over the moon. He keeps talking about what an amazing father he's going to be." I sank onto my couch, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to Emma chatter about due dates and nursery themes, while my mind raced with horrifying possibilities. I knew what David was capable of, knew how his need for control manifested in violence when he didn't get his way. The thought of him having power over Emma and an innocent child made me physically sick. That night, I pulled out the folder I had hidden in the back of my bedroom closet, the one containing all the evidence from my stalking case. Police reports, photos of my slashed tires, screenshots of hundreds of threatening text messages, copies of the emails he had sent to my boss trying to get me fired. The restraining order, signed by a judge who had looked genuinely concerned as he approved it. I stared at the documents for hours, trying to figure out how to use them without destroying Emma's happiness. But every scenario I played out ended the same way. Emma choosing David over me, my family turning against me, and David free to continue his manipulation from the inside. 3 months into Emma's pregnancy, the harassment began again. It started small, things I could almost convince myself were coincidences. My car tires were mysteriously flat after work. My credit cards were suddenly canceled due to suspicious activity. I received anonymous deliveries of dead flowers with notes that said things like, "Thinking of you," and "Can't wait to see you soon." But I knew. I knew it was David, playing his sick games, reminding me that he could reach me whenever he wanted. The restraining order was still active, but these incidents were untraceable, designed to look like random bad luck or pranks from a stranger. The psychological toll was devastating. I started having panic attacks again, jumping at every unexpected sound, checking and rechecking my locks multiple times before bed. I lost weight, lost sleep, lost my ability to focus at work. But I couldn't tell anyone what was happening without revealing the connection to David, and I still couldn't bring myself to destroy Emma's happiness. Emma's baby shower was scheduled for a Saturday in March, exactly 3 years to the day after I had gotten my restraining order against David. The timing felt deliberate, another one of his psychological games designed to remind me of everything he had put me through. I knew I couldn't go. The thought of being in the same room as David, watching him play the devoted father-to-be while my family celebrated him, was more than I could handle. I also knew that my absence would require an explanation, one that I wasn't prepared to give. 2 weeks before the shower, I called Emma to bow out, rehearsing my excuse about a work commitment that I couldn't reschedule. Emma's disappointment was immediate and intense. "Maya, you can't miss my baby shower," she said, her voice taking on a petulant tone I hadn't heard since we were children. "This is one of the most important days of my life, and I need my sister there. I'm so sorry, Em. I tried to move things around that this client meeting has been on the books for months. I lied smoothly. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Can't you just tell them it's a family emergency?" Emma pressed. "I'm sure they'll understand. It doesn't work that way with these big corporate clients," I said, hating myself for the deception but knowing it was necessary. "But I'll take you out for a special dinner afterward, just the two of us. We can celebrate properly." Emma was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold. "Fine, but I want you to know how disappointed I am. David said you probably wouldn't come." The comment hit me like a physical blow. Of course David had predicted my absence. He knew exactly what he was doing, knew that his presence would make it impossible for me to attend. This was all part of his plan to isolate me from my family, to paint me as the selfish sister who couldn't be bothered to show up for important events. "What do you mean he said I wouldn't come?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "He just mentioned that you seem uncomfortable around him, like you're jealous or something," Emma said, and I could hear the accusation in her tone. "I defended you, but honestly, Maya, your behavior toward David has been pretty cold. He's trying so hard to be friends with you, and you barely acknowledge him. I closed my eyes, feeling the walls closing in around me. David was even better at manipulation than I had remembered, slowly poisoning Emma against me while maintaining his innocent facade. I'm not jealous, Emma. I just think you moved pretty fast with him, that's all. We've been together for over a year, Maya. We're having a baby together. At some point, you need to accept that David is part of this family now. The finality in her voice made my chest tight with panic. I was losing my sister to a man who had terrorized me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it without destroying everything. The morning of the baby shower, my phone started buzzing with notifications from social media. Emma had posted a series of photos from the party, and I could see from the comments that my absence was being discussed. My mother had left a comment asking where I was, and Emma had responded publicly that I had chosen work over family. The comments that followed were brutal. Family friends expressing disappointment in my priorities, distant relatives questioning my character, Emma's friends calling me selfish and unsupportive. Each notification felt like a knife to the chest, but I forced myself to read them all, trying to gauge how bad the damage was. By evening, the pile-on had gotten worse. Someone had created a Facebook post specifically about me, questioning what kind of sister would miss such an important event. The post had been shared dozens of times, with people I barely knew weighing in on my supposed character flaws. My phone rang constantly with calls from family members wanting to know what was wrong with me, why I would hurt Emma this way. I turned off my phone and sat in my apartment, staring at the wall and trying to figure out how my life had become such a nightmare. David had managed to turn my entire family against me without ever being directly involved. He was probably at the baby shower right now, playing the concerned brother-in-law, expressing worry about my strange behavior, suggesting that maybe I needed professional help. The final straw came 3 days later when my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced, her face set in the stern expression I remembered from childhood punishments. "Maya, we need to talk," she said, pushing past me into my living room. "Your behavior lately has been completely unacceptable." I closed the door and turned to face her, my heart already racing. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain what?" "How you missed your sister's baby shower for a work meeting. How you've been cold and unwelcoming to David since the day Emma introduced him. How you're letting jealousy ruin your relationship with your sister. And I'm not jealous," I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. "There are things about David that you don't know, like what?" my mother interrupted. "That he's successful? That he loves your sister? That he's excited to be a father? What exactly is your problem with him?" I opened my mouth to tell her everything, to pull out the folder of evidence and show her exactly what kind of man David really was. But the words wouldn't come. I could see the anger and disappointment in my mother's eyes, could imagine how she would react to the revelation that her daughter had been hiding such a massive secret. Would she even believe me? Or would she think I was making it up out of spite? "I just think Emma could do better," I said weakly, hating how pathetic it sounded. My mother's expression hardened. "That's not your decision to make, Maya. Emma is a grown woman, and she's chosen David. They're having a baby together, and they're happy. Your job as her sister is to support her, not to tear down her relationship because you're unhappy with your own life." The accusation stung because it was exactly what David had trained everyone to think. That my objections came from a place of bitterness and jealousy, rather than genuine concern for Emma's safety. "I am happy with my life," I protested. "This has nothing to do with me being single." "Doesn't it?" my mother asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you can't stand to see Emma happy. First, you barely showed up to any of their relationship milestones. Now you're missing her baby shower. What's next, Maya? Are you going to skip the wedding? Miss the birth of your niece or nephew?" I felt cornered, trapped by David's careful manipulation and my own inability to tell the truth. "I'll try to do better," I said finally, the words tasting like defeat. My mother studied my face for a long moment, then sighed. I hope so, because Emma is heartbroken. She loves you, Maya, but she's not going to keep trying forever. At some point, you need to decide whether your pride is more important than your family. After she left, I sat on my couch and cried until I had no tears left. David had won. He had successfully isolated me from my family, painted me as the villain in their story, and positioned himself as the innocent victim of my inexplicable hostility. Emma would never believe me now, not when she was surrounded by people telling her that I was jealous and bitter. 2 weeks later, the harassment escalated. I came home from work to find my apartment door slightly ajar, though I was certain I had locked it that morning. Nothing seemed to be missing, but I could tell someone had been inside. My clothes had been subtly rearranged. My laptop moved slightly. My personal photos touched and repositioned. It was a psychological violation designed to make me feel unsafe in my own home. I called the police, but without evidence of a break-in or anything stolen, there was little they could do. The officer who took my report suggested I change my locks and maybe invest in a security system, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was being paranoid. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed threatening. I knew David was sending me a message. He could reach me whenever he wanted, and there was nothing I could do to stop him. The anonymous messages started arriving the next day. Texts from unknown numbers telling me to stay away from Emma's family, emails with no sender address suggesting that I needed psychiatric help, voicemails from blocked numbers breathing heavily and then hanging up. Each one was carefully crafted to be just vague enough that they couldn't be traced back to David, but specific enough that I knew they were from him. I documented everything, taking screenshots and recordings, but I knew it wouldn't matter. David was too careful, too smart. He had learned from our previous encounters how to terrorize someone without leaving evidence that would hold up in court. Emma's due date was approaching, and with it, the reality that David would soon be the father of my niece or nephew. The thought of him having that kind of power over an innocent child made me physically sick. I knew what he was capable of when he felt his control slipping, and I lived in constant fear of what might happen if Emma ever tried to leave him. 1 month before the baby was due, Emma called me with an invitation that felt like a trap. "Maya, I want to have lunch," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Just the two of us. We need to talk." We met at a restaurant downtown, and I could see immediately that Emma was exhausted. Her pregnancy had been difficult, and the stress was showing in her face. But there was something else there too, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I need to ask you something," Emma said after we had ordered. "And I need you to tell me the truth." My heart started racing. "Okay." "David says you two used to date," Emma said, watching my face carefully. "He says it was a long time ago, before he met me, but that you were pretty serious." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath me. This was it, the moment I had been dreading for over a year. David had finally decided to reveal our connection, probably because he knew I was reaching my breaking point and wanted to control the narrative. "We did date," I admitted quietly. "It was about 3 years ago." Emma nodded slowly. "He told me it didn't end well. That you had a hard time accepting the breakup." "Emma, that's not what happened," I said urgently. "There's so much more to the story. Is there?" Emma interrupted. "Because David showed me some text messages you sent him after they broke up. They were pretty intense, Maya." My blood turned cold. "What text messages?" Emma pulled out her phone and showed me a series of screenshots. They were messages from my number, sent to David, but I had never written them. They were desperate, pleading texts, begging him to take me back, threatening to hurt myself if he didn't respond, accusing him of cheating. The timestamps showed they had been sent over several months, painting a picture of obsessive behavior that made me sick to read. "I never sent those," I whispered, staring at the fake messages in horror. "Emma, I swear to you, I never sent any of those texts." "They're from your phone number," Emma said coldly. "David didn't want to show them to me, but I insisted when I noticed how weird you've been acting around him." "He's lying," I said desperately. "Emma, you have to believe me. David is not who you think he is. He's dangerous." Emma's face hardened. "Dangerous?" "Maya, listen to yourself. David is the most gentle, caring man I've ever known. He's never even raised his voice at me." "That's how it starts," I said, grabbing her hand across the table. "He's charming and perfect until he has you trapped. Emma, I have a restraining order against him." The words hung in the air between us like a bomb. Emma's face went white, then red with anger. "You had a what?" she hissed, yanking her hand away from mine. "A restraining order. From 3 years ago. Emma, he stalked me for months. He threatened me. He harassed me at work. He made my life hell. I have police reports. I have evidence." "You're lying," Emma said flatly. "You're making this up because you can't stand that I'm happy." "I'm not lying," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Emma, why would I make something like this up?" "Because you're jealous," Emma spat. "Because you can't find a man who loves you the way David loves me, so you're trying to ruin my relationship with lies and manipulation." The words cut deep because they echoed exactly what David had been telling everyone. "Emma, please, just let me show you the restraining order. Let me show you the police reports." "I don't want to see your fake evidence," Emma said, standing up from the table. "God, Maya, I knew you were jealous, but I never thought you would stoop this low. Making up stories about restraining orders? What's next? Are you going to claim he hit you?" "Emma, wait." I pleaded, but she was already walking away. "Stay away from me," she called over her shoulder. "Stay away from my baby. And stay away from my family. I never want to see you again." I sat in the restaurant alone, shaking with grief and terror. David had won completely. He had not only isolated me from Emma, but he had turned her against me so thoroughly that she wouldn't even look at evidence of his abuse. And now there was nothing standing between him and the baby, except Emma's naive belief in his goodness. Emma gave birth 3 weeks later to a healthy baby girl they named Sophie. I found out from a Facebook post that my mother shared, a photo of Emma in the hospital bed holding a tiny pink bundle, with David standing beside them looking every inch the proud father. The comments were filled with congratulations and joy, and I felt like I was watching my worst nightmare come to life. I wasn't invited to meet Sophie, wasn't told about the christening, wasn't included in any of the family gatherings that followed. My parents occasionally tried to broker peace between Emma and me, but their efforts were half-hearted. Emma had told them her version of our lunch conversation, painting me as a bitter sister who had made up vicious lies about her boyfriend out of jealousy. 6 months after Sophie was born, the harassment intensified again. David knew that I was completely isolated now, that no one would believe me if I tried to report what he was doing. The messages became more explicit, more threatening. Photos of Emma and Sophie appeared in my mailbox with notes about how beautiful they looked, how fragile they seemed, how easy it would be for something terrible to happen to them. I lived in constant terror, not just for myself but for Emma and Sophie. I knew that David's need for control would eventually manifest in violence, especially if Emma ever tried to assert her independence or question his authority. But there was nothing I could do to protect him without evidence, and David was too smart to leave evidence. The breaking point came on Sophie's first birthday. Emma had posted photos from the party on social media, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes even through her forced smile. Sophie looked healthy and happy, but Emma looked like a shadow of her former self. In one photo, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a bruise on Emma's upper arm, partially hidden by her sleeves but visible if you knew what to look for. It was finger-shaped, the kind of bruise that came from being grabbed too hard. I stared at that photo for hours, zooming in, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. But I knew I wasn't. David had finally started showing his true colors, and Emma was beginning to pay the price. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of being silent, tired of being painted as the villain while David continued his campaign of terror. If no one would believe me in private, maybe it was time to tell my story publicly. I spent the next week compiling everything I had: police reports, photos, screenshots of threatening messages, copies of the restraining order, medical records from the panic attacks David had caused. I organized it all into a comprehensive timeline that showed exactly who David Martinez really was and what he had done to me. Then I wrote my story. Not the sanitized version I had tried to tell Emma, but the full, brutal truth. I described the love-bombing phase of our relationship, how charming and attentive David had been until I was completely hooked. I detailed the slow escalation of control and abuse, the way he had isolated me from friends, monitored my activities, and eventually exploded into full-blown stalking when I tried to leave. I included screenshots of the fake text messages David had shown Emma, explaining how he had likely spoofed my phone number to create false evidence of my supposed obsession. I detailed the current harassment campaign, the break into my apartment, the threatening messages, the photos of Emma and Sophie. Most importantly, I explained why I had stayed silent for so long. How David had systematically turned my family against me, painting me as jealous and bitter, making it impossible for me to tell the truth without seeming vindictive. How he had used Emma and Sophie as weapons against me, knowing that I would rather suffer in silence than risk their safety by speaking out. I posted the story on every social media platform I had, along with redacted copies of the police reports and restraining order. I didn't use David's full name, but I included enough details that anyone who knew him would recognize the story. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared hundreds of times. Comments poured in from people expressing shock, anger, and support. But more importantly, other women started coming forward with their own stories about David. A woman named Jessica messaged me privately, saying that David had dated her roommate 2 years before he met Emma. She described a pattern of behavior that was eerily similar to what I had experienced: love bombing followed by control, isolation, and eventually stalking when the woman tried to leave. Her roommate had moved to another state to get away from him. Another woman, Sarah, shared her own experience with David from several years earlier. She had actually gone to the police about his harassment, but had been told there wasn't enough evidence to prosecute. She still had copies of some of the threatening messages he had sent her. As more women came forward, a clear pattern emerged. David was a serial abuser who targeted vulnerable women, charmed them into submission, then terrorized them when they tried to escape. Emma and I weren't his first victims, and we probably wouldn't be his last if someone didn't stop him. The story spread beyond my social media circles. Someone had sent it to a local news blogger who specialized in exposing domestic abuse, and she reached out to interview me. With my permission, she wrote a more detailed article that included interviews with Jessica and Sarah, painting a comprehensive picture of David's predatory behavior. Within a week, the story had gone viral locally. David's employer, a prestigious law firm, launched an internal investigation after several clients complained about being represented by someone with credible abuse allegations against him. Emma's friends and family members who had attacked me on social media began deleting their comments and sending private apologies. But the most important response came from Emma herself. 3 days after my story went viral, she showed up at my apartment at 11 o'clock at night, holding Sophie and crying so hard she could barely speak. "Maya," she sobbed as I let her in. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I pulled her into my arms, careful not to crush Sophie between us, and held her while she cried. When she finally calmed down enough to speak, the story that poured out of her was even worse than I had imagined. David had started showing his true colors shortly after Sophie was born. It began with criticism disguised as concern, comments about how she was feeding Sophie wrong, how she wasn't losing the baby weight fast enough, how she was too emotional and unstable to be a good mother. When Emma tried to defend herself, he would shut her down with cold silence or threats to take Sophie away. The physical abuse started small, accidental bumps and shoves that escalated into grabbing and shaking when Emma didn't comply with his demands. He controlled every aspect of her life, her schedule, her friends, her family relationships, even how she dressed and what she ate. He monitored her phone and computer, isolated her from support systems, and convinced her that she was lucky he put up with her instability. "When I saw your post," Emma whispered, rocking Sophie gently, "it was like reading about my own life. Every single thing you described, he was doing to me too. The charming phase, the control, the way he twisted everything to make me think I was the problem. Why didn't you leave?" I asked gently, though I already knew the answer. "He said he would take Sophie away from me," Emma replied, fresh tears streaming down her face. "He said I was an unfit mother, that he had documented evidence of my mental instability, that no court would give me custody. He said if I ever tried to leave him, I would never see my daughter again." It was the classic abuser playbook, using Emma's love for her child as a weapon against her. David had calculated exactly how to keep her trapped, just as he had calculated how to isolate me from my family. "Emma, we're going to get you out of this," I said firmly. "Both of you. I have contacts at the domestic violence shelter and there are legal resources he'll find me," Emma interrupted. "Maya, you don't understand. He's a lawyer. He has connections. He knows how to work the system. He's already threatened to ruin me professionally if I ever try to leave. He said he would make sure I never worked again." "He can't do that," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. David was smart and well-connected, and he had probably spent months building a case against Emma, just as he had built one against me. "Can I stay here tonight?" Emma asked quietly. I told him I was visiting my mother, but I'm afraid to go home. "Of course," I said immediately. "You can stay as long as you need to." Emma and Sophie spent the next 3 days at my apartment while we figured out a plan. During that time, Emma shared more details about her life with David that painted an even darker picture of his abuse. He had isolated her from friends by convincing them she was unstable and attention-seeking. He had sabotaged her relationship with her parents by feeding them stories about her mood swings and postpartum depression. He had even convinced her doctor to prescribe anxiety medication, which he then used as evidence of her mental instability. But Emma had been smarter than David realized. Over the past few months, as his abuse escalated, she had started documenting everything. She had photos of bruises hidden on her phone, recordings of his threats, screenshots of his controlling messages. She had been gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to escape. My viral post had given her that moment. Seeing other women come forward with similar stories had validated her own experiences and given her the courage to finally leave. With the help of a domestic violence advocate, we developed a safety plan for Emma and Sophie. She would stay at a confidential shelter location while pursuing a restraining order and filing for emergency custody. I would help her document the abuse and connect her with legal resources. David's reaction to Emma's disappearance was swift and predictable. Within hours of realizing she was gone, he began a campaign of harassment that targeted not just Emma, but me, our parents, and anyone else he thought might be helping her. The messages were threatening and increasingly unhinged, providing exactly the kind of evidence we needed to support Emma's case. But David had underestimated the power of the story going viral. By the time Emma filed for her restraining order, there were multiple women willing to testify about his pattern of abuse. The local news coverage had brought additional victims forward, and the police had reopened investigations into several cold cases involving harassment and stalking that matched David's methods. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week, and David hired an expensive attorney to fight it. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Emma's documentation, combined with the testimonies from his other victims and the physical evidence of his current harassment campaign, painted a clear picture of a dangerous predator who posed a serious threat to Emma, Sophie's safety. I testified at the hearing, sharing my own experience with David, and explaining how he had systematically isolated Emma from her support system. The judge listened carefully as I described the pattern of abuse, the manipulation tactics, and the escalating threats that had culminated in Emma's flight to safety. David sat at the defendant's table, maintaining his composure but unable to hide the rage in his eyes. This was the first time in years that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling in public, and he knew it. His attorney tried to paint Emma and me as vindictive ex-lovers conspiring against an innocent man, but the evidence was too strong. The judge granted Emma's restraining order and awarded her temporary custody of Sophie pending a full custody hearing. David was ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from Emma, Sophie, me, and our family members. He was also prohibited from contacting any of us directly or indirectly. But restraining orders are just pieces of paper, and we all knew that David wouldn't be stopped by a legal document. The real test would come in the days and weeks that followed, as he processed this loss of control and decided how to respond. David's first move was predictable. He launched a social media campaign designed to discredit Emma and me. He created fake accounts and began spreading rumors that Emma was mentally unstable, that she was keeping his child from him out of spite, that I had manipulated her into making false accusations. His friends and family rallied around him, posting messages of support and attacking Emma's character. But the court of public opinion had already turned against David. Too many women had come forward with similar stories. Too much evidence had been presented. His attempts at damage control only made him look more desperate and manipulative. More importantly, his violation of the restraining order through social media gave us additional ammunition for the custody case. Emma's attorney documented every post, every fake account, every attempt at indirect contact. David was digging his own grave, with each desperate attempt to regain control. The full custody hearing took place 6 weeks later, and it was a comprehensive dismantling of David's carefully constructed image. Emma testified about the abuse she had suffered, supported by photos, recordings, and medical records. I testified about my own experience and the pattern of behavior that connected my case to Emma's. But the most damning testimony came from David's other victims. Jessica, Sarah, and 3 other women took the stand to describe their experiences with David, painting a picture of a serial predator who had been terrorizing women for years. The judge's expression grew increasingly grim as each woman shared her story. David's attorney tried to argue that these women were all lying, that they had been coached by Emma and me as part of an elaborate conspiracy. But the consistency of their stories, combined with the physical evidence, made that argument impossible to believe. The judge awarded Emma full custody of Sophie, with David receiving only supervised visitation rights. He was ordered to complete anger management and domestic violence intervention programs before any consideration of expanded visitation. The judge also extended the restraining order for an additional 2 years. David's reaction to losing custody was explosive. That night, he violated the restraining order by showing up at my apartment building, screaming threats and accusations from the parking lot. Neighbors called the police, and David was arrested for violating the protective order. This time, he spent 3 days in jail before making bail. The arrest was the final straw for David's law firm. They terminated his employment immediately, citing the criminal charges and the negative publicity surrounding his case. Without his prestigious job and the income that came with it, David's carefully constructed life began to unravel completely. But losing his job and his family only made David more dangerous. The harassment escalated to a level that terrified even me, someone who had lived through his abuse before. He began following Emma and me, always staying just outside the legal boundaries of the restraining order but making his presence known. He left threatening messages on our cars, sent anonymous packages to our workplaces, and created elaborate online harassment campaigns using fake identities. The police took the threat seriously now, especially given David's history and the media attention the case had received. They increased patrols around Emma's shelter and my apartment, and assigned a detective to investigate the ongoing harassment. That detective, Maria Rodriguez, became our lifeline during the darkest period of David's campaign of terror. She understood the psychology of stalkers and abusers, and she was determined to build a case that would put David away for a significant period of time. Detective Rodriguez worked tirelessly to connect David to the various harassment campaigns, using digital forensics to trace the fake accounts and anonymous messages back to him. She coordinated with law enforcement in other jurisdictions where David's previous victims lived, building a comprehensive case that spanned multiple states and several years. The breakthrough came when David made a critical mistake. In his rage and desperation, he sent a threatening email to Emma's attorney from his personal email account, apparently forgetting to use one of his fake identities. The email contained explicit threats against Emma, Sophie, and me, along with detailed descriptions of what he planned to do to us. David was arrested the next day on charges of criminal harassment, violation of a protective order, and making terroristic threats. This time, the judge denied bail, citing David's escalating behavior and the credible threat he posed to multiple victims. The criminal trial took place 8 months later, and it was a media sensation. The courtroom was packed with supporters, reporters, and other victims who had been inspired by Emma's courage to come forward. The prosecutor painted a comprehensive picture of David's predatory behavior, using testimony from 6 different victims to establish a clear pattern of abuse. David's defense attorney tried to argue that his client was the victim of a vindictive conspiracy, but the evidence was overwhelming. Digital forensics proved that David had created dozens of fake social media accounts to harass his victims. Phone records showed that he had made hundreds of threatening calls from blocked numbers. Security camera footage placed him at locations where his victims had been stalked. The most powerful moment of the trial came when Emma took the stand to describe the impact David's abuse had on her and Sophie. She spoke calmly and clearly about the fear she had lived with, the way David had controlled every aspect of her life, and the ongoing trauma that continued to affect her daily existence. "He didn't just abuse me physically and emotionally," Emma testified, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "He stole my sense of safety, my ability to trust my own judgment, my relationship with my family. He used my love for my daughter as a weapon against me, threatening to take her away if I ever tried to protect myself. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. David was sentenced to 5 years in prison, followed by 10 years of probation with no contact orders protecting all of his victims. As the bailiff led David away in handcuffs, he turned to look at Emma and me one last time. The mask of charm and manipulation was completely gone, replaced by pure hatred and rage. For a moment, I saw exactly what Emma had lived with for over a year, the monster that had hidden behind the facade of the perfect boyfriend and father. But we had won. David would be locked away for years, unable to hurt Emma, Sophie, or any other woman. The legal system had finally worked the way it was supposed to, protecting victims and holding abusers accountable for their actions. The aftermath of David's conviction brought a mixture of relief and continued healing. Emma slowly began to rebuild her life, starting with repairing the relationships that David had damaged through his manipulation. Our parents were devastated when they learned the full extent of what had happened, consumed with guilt over how they had treated me and failed to protect Emma. "How did we not see it?" my mother asked through tears during one of our family therapy sessions. "How did we let him fool us so completely?" "Because that's what abusers do," our therapist explained patiently. "They're expert manipulators who specifically target the people closest to their victims. David studied your family dynamics and used them against you, turning you into unwitting accomplices in Emma's isolation. It was a hard truth to accept, but understanding David's methods helped our family begin to heal. We learned about the warning signs of abuse, the tactics that manipulators use to control their victims and the people around them. Most importantly, we learned to trust Emma's experiences and support her unconditionally as she continued to recover. Emma found a new apartment in a secure building across town where she could raise Sophie safely. She started therapy to deal with the trauma of David's abuse and began slowly rebuilding her social connections. It was a long process, but gradually, I began to see glimpses of the confident, happy person my sister had been before David entered her life. Sophie, thankfully, was too young to remember much of the chaos surrounding her early years. She grew into a bright, curious toddler who brought joy and laughter back into our family gatherings. Emma was a devoted mother, perhaps overly protective at times, but determined to give Sophie the safe, stable childhood she deserved. The viral nature of my original post had unexpected long-term consequences. I began receiving messages from women all over the country who were trapped in similar situations, asking for advice and support. Many of them had been isolated from their families and friends, just as Emma and I had been, and they felt like they had nowhere to turn. I started volunteering with the local domestic violence shelter, sharing my story at support groups, and helping other survivors navigate the legal system. Emma joined me after a few months, finding purpose and healing in helping other women escape abusive relationships. Together, we developed workshops for families and friends of abuse victims, teaching them how to recognize the signs of manipulation and provide support without judgment. We shared our story of how David had turned our family against each other, and how we had worked to repair those relationships after his conviction. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply rewarding. Every woman we helped escape an abusive relationship felt like a victory against David and men like him. Every family we reunited felt like proof that love and truth could overcome manipulation and lies. 2 years after David's conviction, Emma met someone new. James was a gentle, patient man who understood her history and respected her boundaries. He never tried to rush their relationship or pressure her into commitments she wasn't ready for. Most importantly, he loved Sophie unconditionally and treated her like his own daughter. I was nervous when Emma first introduced James to the family, still hypervigilant for signs of manipulation or control. But James was genuinely kind, with no hidden agenda or ulterior motives. He supported Emma's independence, encouraged her friendships, and welcomed her family with open arms. Their relationship progressed slowly and healthily, built on trust and communication, rather than the whirlwind intensity that had characterized Emma's relationship with David. When James proposed after 2 years of dating, it was with Emma's full consent and enthusiasm, not because she felt pressured or trapped. The engagement party was everything Emma's first one should have been: joyful, authentic, and surrounded by people who truly loved and supported her. As I watched her laugh with genuine happiness for the first time in years, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for how far we had all come. David remained in prison, though we occasionally received updates about his attempts to appeal his conviction or gain early release. Each attempt was unsuccessful, blocked by the comprehensive evidence against him and the testimony of his many victims. He would be locked away for several more years, and when he was finally released, he would face strict supervision and permanent restraining orders. Sometimes I wondered if David understood the magnitude of what he had lost through his need for control. He had destroyed his career, his freedom, and any chance of a relationship with Sophie. He had turned himself from a successful attorney into a convicted felon, all because he couldn't accept that women had the right to make their own choices. But I realized that trying to understand David's psychology was less important than focusing on the lives he had affected. Emma was thriving in her new relationship and career. Sophie was growing up surrounded by love and support. The other women David had victimized were healing and moving forward with their lives. As for me, I had learned that speaking the truth, even when it seemed impossible, was always worth the risk. My decision to go public with my story had not only saved Emma and Sophie, but had protected countless other potential victims from David's manipulation. The experience had also taught me the power of believing survivors, even when their stories seemed unbelievable or inconvenient. David had counted on people's reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths, their willingness to believe the charming facade rather than investigate the reality beneath it. 3 years after David's conviction, Emma and James were married in a small ceremony, surrounded by family and close friends. Emma looked radiant in her wedding dress, her smile genuine and unforced. As I watched her dance with her new husband, I felt a profound sense of peace. We had survived David's campaign of terror and manipulation. We had rebuilt our family relationships and learned to trust each other again. Emma had found real love with someone who respected and cherished her. Sophie was growing up safe and protected. The road to recovery had been long and difficult, filled with setbacks and challenges that sometimes seemed insurmountable. But we had persevered, supported by our love for each other and our determination to not let David's abuse define our lives. As I held Sophie during the wedding reception, watching her laugh at the bubbles floating around the dance floor, I realized that this was David's ultimate defeat. He had tried to destroy our family, to isolate us from each other and break our spirits. Instead, he had made us stronger, more united, and more committed to protecting each other. The little girl in my arms would grow up knowing that she was loved and protected, that the women in her family were strong and resilient, that speaking the truth was always worth the cost. She would never know the fear and control that David had tried to impose on our lives. That realization filled me with a deep sense of satisfaction and closure. David Martinez had tried to make us victims, but in the end, we had become survivors. We had taken back our power, reclaimed our voices, and built lives filled with genuine love and happiness. The story I had posted online in desperation 3 years earlier had seemed like a last resort, a final attempt to make someone believe the truth about David's abuse. I never could have imagined that it would lead to justice not just for Emma and me, but for all of David's victims. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight in silence, enduring abuse and manipulation while trying to protect the people we love. But sometimes, breaking that silence and speaking our truth can change everything, not just for ourselves, but for others who are still trapped in similar situations. Emma and I had learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the people who believe in you, support you, and stand by you when the world seems dark and hopeless. Our family had been broken by David's manipulation, but it had been rebuilt stronger than ever through our commitment to truth, healing, and unconditional love. As the evening wore on and the wedding celebration continued around us, I felt grateful for every difficult step that had brought us to this moment. The pain, the fear, the isolation, the struggle for justice, all of it had been worth it to see Emma truly happy and free. David Martinez had tried to write the story of our lives, casting himself as the hero and us as the unstable, jealous women who couldn't accept his perfection. But in the end, we had taken back the pen and written our own ending, one filled with truth, justice, and the kind of love that no abuser could ever destroy. The last update I received about David was that he had been transferred to a different prison after several incidents with other inmates. Apparently, his crimes against women hadn't made him popular with his fellow prisoners. He would serve out the remainder of his sentence in protective custody, isolated from the general population. It seemed fitting that David, who had spent so much energy isolating his victims, would end up isolated himself. He had lost everything: his freedom, his career, his reputation, and any chance of a relationship with Sophie. The control he had desperately sought had ultimately led to his complete powerlessness. Meanwhile, Emma, Sophie, and I continued to build lives filled with genuine connections and authentic happiness. We had learned that real love doesn't seek to control or manipulate, it supports and empowers. We had discovered that speaking the truth, even when it's difficult and painful, is the only path to genuine freedom. The baby shower I had missed 3 years ago seemed like a lifetime away now. At the time, my absence had been seen as selfishness and jealousy. Now, it was understood as an act of self-preservation that had ultimately saved not just me, but Emma and Sophie as well. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is refuse to enable someone's abuse, even when that refusal is misunderstood by the people we're trying to protect. Sometimes standing up for the truth means standing alone, at least for a while, until others are ready to see what we've been trying to show them. As I tucked Sophie into bed that night after the wedding, she looked up at me with Emma's eyes and asked, "Aunt Maya, will you tell me a story?" I smiled and settled into the chair beside her bed. "Once upon a time," I began, "there was a little girl who was surrounded by people who loved her very much. And no matter what challenges they faced, they always found a way to protect each other and stay together. It was the only story that mattered now, the one we were still writing together, day by day, choice by choice. A story of love conquering manipulation, truth defeating lies, and family bonds that no abuser could ever break." Sophie fell asleep with a smile on her face, safe and loved and protected. And I knew that David Martinez, wherever he was in his prison cell, had lost completely and forever. We had won not just the legal battle, but the war for our souls, our voices, and our right to live freely and authentically. The nightmare was over. The healing would continue. And our story, the real story, would go on.